At the end of the 70s, American amateur hockey was suffering the same malaise as the nation itself. In the 20 years since winning the gold medal at the 1960 Olympics, American teams had become increasingly unable to compete with the dominant Europeans, especially the Soviet Union, whose players were amateurs in name only.
The Americans were always amateurs, college kids, some of them, or recent graduates who still played the game, but certainly not at the Russian level. There was no way that they could be competitive. And the feeling going into 1980 was they really haven't got much of a chance, even though it's here in Lake Placid.
The goal was to avoid being embarrassed at home. So in July of 1979, the best amateur players in the country were invited to try out for the 1980 Olympic team.
They invited us all to Colorado Springs, and they divided us up into 4 teams. Basically, Eastern guys, Michigan guys, Minnesota guys, and an at-large team. Over the course of 10 days in Colorado Springs, those 4 teams played a round robin. It was a nerve-wracking situation. It was a pressure-packed situation. And as that tournament went on, it was being evaluated by Herb Brooks.
Mike, heads up, Mike.
Herb Brooks never went to charm school.
Get it off, quick.
If he had, he would have flunked out.
What are you calling a hook on that, Stan?
He was abrasive.
There's 2 teams playing this thing, Stan.
Intense.
Tracy hooked him. Get in that game now, will ya?
He was also the best college hockey coach in the country.
People were a little afraid of him. He'd always been considered kind of an outsider, had his own way of thinking, his own way of doing things.
First, Brooks had to trim the roster from 80 to 26. So he began by keeping the players he knew best, ones who had helped him win 3 NCAA championships at the University of Minnesota in the 70s. They included Mike Ramsey and Bill Baker, Neil Broughton and Rob McClanahan, Eric Strobel and Buzz Schneider. But Brooks knew he couldn't be provincial.
Herb wanted to make sure that it didn't look like a Minnesota team because he was from Minnesota. He wanted to make sure there was a good balance.
So Brooks looked eastward to another college hockey powerhouse, Boston University, where he got Jack O'Callahan, a defenseman with an attitude, and Michael Ruzioni, whose name in Italian means eruption, perfectly fitting his personality. To fill the most important role, Brooks picked 22-year-old Jim Craig, who'd been playing goaltender since he began skating on the frozen ponds of New England.
I started to play goal because I didn't know the rules. And I figured, it's not too hard. You're just supposed to keep that puck out of the net.
He kept the puck out of the net as well as any amateur goaltender around.
I spent a lot of time with Jimmy and talked to Jimmy an awful lot. Jimmy was the guy in my mind that I thought we had to put the saddle on.
Brooks filled out the team with gritty players like Mark Johnson from the University of Wisconsin, John Harrington and Mark Pavelich from Minnesota Duluth, Kenny Morrow from Bowling Green, and tapped others, mostly from colleges in the upper Midwest. They were tough and fast and disciplined. But compared to the world's best, the players who were called amateurs, but in reality played hockey for a living, the Americans were just a bunch of kids, not feared and not respected.
We were by far the youngest, most inexperienced team when it came to the Olympic Games. We were just college kids playing flat out professional, older, stronger, better, athletes. So it was a real formidable task.
Behind the Iron Curtain, another intense coach was preparing his team for Lake Placid. But Viktor Tikhonov didn't have any of Herb Brooks's problems. The Soviets were the best hockey team in the world, and everybody knew it. So Tikhonov's goal was simple: to return home to Moscow with his nation's 5th straight Olympic hockey gold medal. That his own players despised him meant nothing.
I would say he was fanatic, thinking of hockey 24 hours per day. He wanted that the Soviet Union or Russia will be #1 everywhere and anywhere. And he wanted that every player who plays for him will think the same way. The players hated him, big time.
The life was intense, practically without family, children or hobbies. It was only work.
Vladislav Tretiak grew up just outside of Moscow and became immersed in the Soviet sports machine at a young age. He developed into perhaps the greatest goaltender to ever play and starred on the Soviet national team for over 15 years.
We lived in camps for 9 months out of the year. We trained, studied theory and practiced 3 times a day. It was a difficult and harsh life. I saw my wife and children rarely. But the thing is, I loved hockey very much. I thought that's the way it should be, and I was ready to sacrifice and put discipline ahead of everything in order to be first and for my team to win.
Tretiak and his teammates were first, year after year. Their lives and careers were controlled by the Soviet government, because technically, they were soldiers in the Red Army, but only technically.
I went from a private to lieutenant colonel, but didn't do any army stuff. For the most part, we were fully devoted to hockey.
By 1980, Boris Mikhailov was already a 10-year veteran of the Soviet national team and the most recognizable face in international hockey.
Sport was tied with politics, and any victory had big political undertones, especially during the Olympic Games, when the General Secretary and everybody else was worried about how we would represent our country. Our task was only to place first.
Mikhailov and his teammates represented the Soviet Union by demolishing just about anyone who got in their way. They were government-sponsored magicians on ice who had been dominating international hockey since the darkest days of the Cold War.
It was a dynasty, definitely, for 10, 20, 30 years. Their main goal was to win in every game, every period, every shift. It was one regular season when they won 43 out of 44 games.
64, 68, 72, 76, right up until 1980, the Soviets were unbeatable in the Olympics.
They played hockey the way we played basketball, with the same kind of control of the puck, the same kind of intricate offensive patterns, and of course the presence in goal of Tretiak. How could you beat him?
Back in the U.S., Herb Brooks had been contemplating that same question for years.
They could execute at such a high level of speed, skating, passing, shooting, thinking. I tried to develop a team that would throw their game right back at them.
Starting in August of '79, Brooks began employing his main team-building exercise, beginning a rugged 6-month pre-Olympic training program with a strategy. To bond them as a team, his players needed one common enemy, him.
Herb always liked that, where it would be you against him. He was the bad guy. He liked being in that bad guy role.
I remember when he told us, I'll be a coach, but I won't be a friend. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be a long year.
Herbie threw compliments around like manhole covers.
He quoted in the paper that I had $1 million set of legs and a 10-cent fart for a brain.
He'd give you that glare and that look, and it's like, oh my God, what did I do wrong now?
I can honestly say that there was no sense of regionalism on that team. There was a sense of Herbieism.
And if Herbieism had a language, it could be found in a tiny notebook the players secretly kept, documenting each moment their coach began to sound like a cross between Yogi Berra and Casey Stengel. The players called his strange motivational sayings Brooksisms.
A couple of my favorite Brooksisms on our team: you don't have enough talent to win on talent alone.
There's a fine line between guts and brain.
Ramsey, you're playing worse and worse every day, and right now you're playing like it's next week.
Harrington, you're playing worse every day, and right now you're playing like the middle of next month.
Christoph, you suck. You know, you're getting worse every day, and today you're playing like next month. I mean, that was a tip word, but he was right.
And his strategy was working. Herb Brooks was transforming them into a team.
Our Olympic team got very tight with the idea that it was us versus him. And we're constantly, as a group, trying to prove to him that we're good enough to play.
It was Herbie bashing from day one until the final day of the Olympics. It really made them a unit.
As September arrived, it was time to start playing against future Olympic competition. So Brooks took the team to Europe for a series of exhibition games. The Americans started out strong, winning 6 of their first 8. But Brooks kept pressing. Before a game against Norway, a team they would have to face at the Olympics, he issued a challenge.
I said, guys, we're going to have to play the Norwegians in qualifications. So we do it tonight. We send a message right now.
But playing flat and uninspired hockey, the U.S. could only muster a 3-3 tie, and Brooks was furious.
As we went to get off the ice, Herbie ran from the bench down to the gate, and said, stay out on the ice.
Steam's coming out of his ears. He's so hot that we had tied Norway, which was the weakest team we had played over there.
If that's all we can do is tie the Norway national team 3-3, and you think you're going to go to the Olympics and be successful, you got another guest coming.
He's standing there with his suit on, and he makes us all get behind the net and on the goal line, and he starts blowing his whistle.
And we did what are called herbies, which are blue line back, red line back, far blue line back, all the way down and back.
2 or 3 of those would be tiring.
Blue line back, red line back, blue line back, down and back.
10 or 12 of them would be excessive.
And we did them for about 45 minutes to an hour. The rink attendant turned the lights off on us, and we still skated in the dark.
In the dark, he's screaming at us. Booming voice around this empty arena, you know. It was pretty intense.
The message went out right then. They're not going to play the game like that and disgrace their abilities or our collective efforts.
No one knows exactly how many herbies were done that night, but to the players, it was a turning point.
That moment probably had more to do with us gelling as a team, feeling like we were a group, a family. We looked at each other and said, you know, basically he can do anything he wants to us. He's not going to break us.
On February 9th, 1980, at Madison Square Garden in New York City, they skated onto the ice to play a fundraising exhibition game, just 3 days before the start of the Olympics. But to their opponents on this night, it wasn't just an exhibition. Because any time the Soviet Union's top team played against Americans, they played to win. The Soviets had just recently embarrassed the NHL All-Stars in a 3-game series, winning the Challenge Cup on American ice. With the Olympics only days away, they were rolling over opponents like a red tidal wave.
They were the Red Menace, and they wore the CCCP across their chests, and they were very, very intimidating.
You had heard about them. You'd known how good they were. You'd known about their successes, and now you were going to play them. And that night it was, welcome to the real world, boys.
We got crushed, and we thought, these guys are in another world.
They just kicked us around that rink. The goals they scored were, you could have filmed them. They were so beautiful.
They were like robots. When they scored a goal, they never smiled. I don't think I ever saw them smile.
We were about ready to stand up and applaud him, but we didn't see anything like that before. The guys hitting elbow. Did you see that goal? Did you see his move? It's like, we were spectators.
I looked up at the scoreboard. It said 10-3. It might as well have said 20-0. 10-3 made it sound closer than it was. It was no contest.
There couldn't have been a greater low point, given the preparation and the work that we had put in. It was very demoralizing.
This dose of hockey reality brought U.S. hopes back to earth. As each team left New York City for upstate Lake Placid, their futures seemed clear.
Anybody who left Madison Square Garden that day thought to themselves, the Soviets will win every game in the Olympics, take home the gold medal, and never be challenged. And the U.S., all you knew is that when it came time to face the big bear, they had no chance.
The Soviets barely had to compete in the early rounds, as they breezed past Japan and the Netherlands by a combined score of 33-4. The Americans opened against heavily favored Sweden, and playing a nervous and tentative game, trailed 2-1 late in the final period.
I remember the U.S. had several opportunities to tie the game, and you just got the feeling, and of course as the clock ticks down and now you're under a minute, well, it's not to be.
With only 41 seconds left, Brooks pulled Jim Craig from the goal, putting an extra skater on the ice, but leaving the American net empty. It was a desperate move for a desperate team.
Fighting for control of the puck with 29 seconds to play. Baker on it,
He was just trying to get it on net. And I couldn't believe it when it went in, you know.
You can always wonder, if Billy doesn't score, what happens to the hockey team? Well, Billy did score.
And the Americans in the key game. In the first round, tie it up.
That was the biggest goal of the Olympics, because if the Americans lose that game, they're virtually out of contention before the Olympic Games start.
The